The rain in this city didn't wash away the filth, it only made the grime slicker, rodder to grip. 4-year-old Leo pressed his small, trembling body against the cold, wet brick of the alleyway. His oversized hoodie soaked through to his skin. He wasn't crying. Crying was a waste of energy, and right now, every ounce of his strength needed to be directed at survival. He looked down at the bundle in his arms. It wasn't a real puppy, just a mangy, shivering stray he'd found near the dumpster. But it was the only thing in this world that didn't want to hurt him. It's okay, buddy, Leo whispered, his voice raspy but steady, sounding far too old for his age. I won't let them take you, I promise. But the promise felt heavy, like a stone in his gut. He was just a kid. He knew the math of his situation better than any adult ever could. His mother, Alina, was out there somewhere, likely being dragged back to the nightmare she had escaped, while he was left here, a loose end that needed to be tied up. Leo tightened his grip on the dog and stepped out of the shadows. The alley opened up to the grand, imposing entrance of the Sterling Tower. It was a fortress of glass and steel, the headquarters of the most powerful man in the city, Julian Sterling. Leo didn't know the man, but he knew power when he saw it, and right now, power was the only currency that mattered. Hema rushed up the steps, his small sneakers squeaking on the marble. Two massive security guards in black suits stepped forward, their hands hovering near their holsters. Lost, the guard on the left grunted, looking down with a mixture of annoyance and pity. This isn't a playground, scram. Leo didn't flinch. He tilted his head back, his hazel eyes sharp, intelligent, and burning with a fierce, protective fire, locking onto the guards. I need to see Mr. Sterling, Leo said, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. It's an emergency. And it's about the merger with Vance Logistics. The guards exchanged a bewildered glance. Vance Logistics was Alina's family company, the very company Mr. Leo's biological father was trying to steal. How could this filthy child know that name? Beat it, brat, the second guard snapped, reaching out to grab Leo's shoulder. Before the hand could make contact, the heavy glass doors swung open. The air pressure in the entryway seemed to drop. A sudden, suffocating silence falling over the scene. Julian Sterling stood there. He was dressed in a charcoal 3-piece suit that cost more than most people around in a year. His face a mask of cold, aristocratic indifference, but his eyes, dark, were fixed entirely on the small boy blocking his path. Let him go, Julian commanded. His voice wasn't loud, but it carried the weight of absolute authority. The guards instantly recoiled, stepping back as if burned. Julian descended the stairs, his gaze never leaving Leo. He stopped a few feet away, towering over the child. You know a lot for a kid standing in the rain with a rat, Julian said, his tone unreadable. Leo lifted his chin, refusing to be intimidated by the titan of industry. Has not a rat, he's a dog, and he's hungry. Leo shifted the shivering animal in his arms. I'm not here for money. I'm here because my mommy is in trouble. And you're the only one strong enough to stop the bad men. Julian felt a strange, sharp pang in his chest. He had spent his life building walls, shutting out the world to protect his empire. He didn't do charity, he didn't do rescues, but looking into Leo's eyes, he saw a reflection of his own lonely, a rotten soul. He saw a fighter. Your mother? Julian asked, crouching down slightly, bringing himself closer to Leo's eye level. Is she Alina Vance? Leo said. And if you don't help her, I'm going to have to do it myself. And I'm only 4. The sheer absurdity of the statement, delivered with such deadly seriousness, almost made Julian smile. Almost. He reached out, his large, manicured hand gently covering Leo's small, freezing fingers. Get in the car, Julian said, his voice softening in a way that shocked his security team. We're going to get your mother. And we're going to burn anyone who tries to stop us to the ground. Leo hesitated for only a second, his analytical mind processing the offer. He nodded. He climbed into the back of the sleek, black, the stray dog tucked safely under his arm, as the car pulled away, leaving the rain-slicked streets behind. Leo looked at the powerful man beside him. He had found his weapon. Now, he just had to make sure Julian Sterling didn't break before the war was over. The interior of the Maybach was a sanctuary of silence, a stark contrast to the chaotic, rain-lashed streets outside. The soft ambient lighting cast long, elegant shadows across the plush leather seats. Julian sat, his mind racing as he watched the small boy in the rear view mirror. Leo hadn't spoken since they left the alley. He was entirely focused on the shivering, mud-caked stray in his lap, whispering words of comfort that no 4-year-old should know. Julian's jaw tightened. The name Alina Vance echoed in his mind like a wee running bell. Vance Logistics was a mid-tier shipping firm, currently bleeding out from a hostile takeover orchestrated by the Moretti crime syndicate. Elena Vance was the widow of the founder, a woman Julian had met only once at a Che Ritty gala 3 years ago. She had been polite, painfully shy, and entirely out of her depth. He had assumed she had either sold the company or been swallowed whole by the Shea rocks circling her. He hadn't realized she was fighting a WER in the trenches. "Are you cold?" Julian asked, his voice low, breaking the silence. Leo didn't look up. His small fingers were gently stroking the dog's matted fur. "But Ba Renabi is ca red. He doesn't like loud noises." Julian suppressed a sigh. The kid had named a street rat. It was also the most endia ring thing Julian had heard in a decade. "We're almost there," Julian said, his tone shifting from conversational to tactical. "Leo, I need you to understand something. When we get to your home, things might be complicated. My men will secure the perimeter. I need you to stay in the CAR until I give the signal." Leo finally lifted his head. His hazel eyes met Julian's in the mirror, and the sheer, unadulterated maturity in them made the billionaire's breath catch. Leo said firmly, "You don't get it, Sterling. The bad men don't just want the company, they want me. I'm the leverage." Julian's blood ran cold. He had expected a corporate dispute. He hadn't expected a child to be the prima rida rajet. The Morettis weren't just businessmen, they were ruthless. If they had Elena cornered, they would use her son to force her signature on the transfer documents. "Why would they want you?" Julian asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Leo looked down at Bernabe, his expression de-reckoning. "Because mommy hid the real ledger. The one that proves daddy didn't die in an accident. He was murdered by Uncle Monarchus, and I know where it is." The CAR seemed to drop a few degrees in temperature. Julian's grip on the steering wheel tightened until his knuckles turned white. This wasn't a hostile takeover. It was a cover-up. A 4-year-old child was sitting in his CAR-ing the weight of a murder investigation and a multi-million-dollar AR extortion plot. Julian pulled the CAR over to the curb, a block away from a dilapidated brownstone in the city's industrial district. The building looked abandoned, its windows boarded up, the brickwork crumbling. But Julian's trained eyes caught the subtle signs of occupation, the fresh tire tracks in the mud, the faint glow of a cigarette cherry behind a second-floor window, the black SUV parked around the corner. "They're already inside," Julian murmured, his mind shifting into overdrive. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a sleek, encrypted satellite phone. He didn't dial a number, he pressed a single. "Rick Vance," Julian said into the phone, his voice stripped of all emotion, leaving only pure lethal command. "I need a tactical team at my location in 3 minutes. Non-lethal. We have a hostage situation. 1 adult female, 1 minor. Hostiles are." He hung up and turned in his seat to face Leo. The boy was watching him with intense, calculating focus. "Listen to me, Leo," Julian said, his voice softer now, but no less intense. "I am going to get your mother. I am going to make sure no one ever hurts either of you again. But I need you to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Leo studied Julian's face, reaching for any sign of deception. He found none. What he found was a man whose protective instincts were as fierce as his own. Leo whispered, "But you have to promise me something, anything. Don't let them take Rabi." Julian stared at the boy. In the face of armed criminals, in the shadow of his mother's possible death, Leo's primary concern was a stray dog. It was a level of empathy and loyalty that shattered whatever remained of Julian's cynical heart. Julian said, and for the first time in his life, Julian Sterling made a vow not to a board of directors or a business PA Rotner, but to a child. "Bernabe comes with us." Before Leo could respond, the front door of the brownstone burst open. 2 men in DAR clothing stumbled out, shouting in Italian. They were followed by a third man, dragging a woman by the AR Melina. She looked nothing like the polished socialite Julian remembered. Her hair was disheveled, her face bruised, her clothes torn, but even from a distance, Julian could see the defiance in her posture. She was fighting, kicking, screaming, refusing to go quiet. Leo cried out, his composure finally breaking. He fumbled with the door handle, but Julian was faster. "Stay," his voice a thunderclap. He shoved Leo back into the seat and locked the child's safety doors. "Do not move." Julian was out of the CAR before the door fully closed. He didn't wait for his tactical team. He didn't wait for backup. The sight of Elena Vance, battered and terrified, ignited a fury in him that was entirely alien, entirely consuming. He crossed the distance in 3 long strides. The first man turned, raising a pistol, but Julian was already moving. A brutal, efficient strike to the man's wrist sent the gun clattering to the pavement. A knee to the solar plexus dropped him instantly. The second man lunged, but Julian sidestepped, grabbing the man's jacket and hurling him into the brick wall with bone, ring force. The man crumpled, unconscious. The third man, the one holding Alina, panicked. He grabbed her by the throat, pressing a blade to her neck. Stay back, he screamed, his voice cracking. I'll kill her. Elena's eyes were wide with terror, but as she looked past her captor, her gaze landed on Julian. She didn't see a savior, she saw a storm. Let her go, Julian said, his voice a low, deadly rumble. He took a step forward, his hands empty, his posture relaxed but coiled like a spring. You have nowhere to run. Your men are down. The police are 3 minutes away. You are already dead. The only question is whether you want to die quickly or painfully. The man hesitated, his eyes rotting between Julian and the approaching sirens. That hesitation was all Julian needed. In a blur of motion, Julian closed the distance. He seized the man's wrist, twisting it with surgical precision until the knife dropped. A swift, devastating elbow to the jaw sent the man sprawling to the ground. Out cold Alina collapsed, her knees hitting the wet pavement. She gasped for air, clutching her bruised neck, her body shaking violently. Julian knelt beside her, his movements surprisingly gentle. He didn't touch her, respecting her space, but he positioned himself between her and the street, a human shield against the world. Elena, he said softly, I've got you. She looked up at him, her eyes filling with tears. She recognized him. Julian, she whispered, her voice a broken rasp. Your son, Julian said, his gaze flickering toward the Maybach. He came to me. Elena's eyes widened in horror. No. He's supposed to be at the shelter. He's supposed to be safe. He is safe, Julian assured her, his voice firm. He's in the car, and he's not alone. As if on cue, the rear door of the Maybach clicked open. Leo stepped out into the rain, Bernabe tucked securely under his hair. He ran to his mother, throwing his small arms around her neck, burying his face in her shoulder. He sobbed, the brave facade finally cracking. Elena wrapped her arms around him, holding him so tightly it was as if she were trying to merge their souls. She buried her face in his hair, her tears mingling with the rain. My baby, my brave boy, she wept. Julian watched them, the rain soaking through his expensive suit, the sirens wailing closer. He felt a profound, terrifying shift in the foundation of his life. He had come to rescue a business asset. He had found a family. But as he watched Alina stroke Leo's hair, a new, Rucker realization settled in his gut. The Morettis wouldn't stop. They had lost their leverage, but they still had their pride. And they would come for Alina and Leo again. Julian stood up, turning to face the street as the black tactical vans screeched to a halt. His men poured out, securing the scene, arresting the unconscious thugs. Julian pulled out his phone again, dialing his head of security. Vance, his voice cold and absolute, initiate protocol Omega. I want a full sweep of the Moretti network. Every shell company, every safe house, every associate. Burn it all to the ground. He hung up and walked back to Alina and Leo. He knelt down again, this time extending a hand to Alina. He said, his voice a quiet promise in the storm. Let's go home. Alina looked at his hand, then up at his face. She saw the violence in his eyes, the absolute, unwavering devotion. She took his hand, letting him pull her to her feet. As they walked toward the car, Leo looked up at Julian. You kept your promise, the boy whispered. Julian looked down at the child, then at the woman beside him. The rain washed away the blood and the grime, but it couldn't wash away the bond that had just been forged in the crucible of violence. I always keep my promises, Julian said, his voice a vow etched in stone. Now, let's go get your dog a real bed. But as the car door closed, sealing them in safety, Julian's eyes met Alina's in the rear view mirror. The relief in her eyes was palpable, but beneath it, Julian saw the lingering shadow of FAR. The battle was won, but the WR had just begun, and Julian Sterling had never lost a GUR. The penthouse suite of the Sterling Tower was a masterclass in minimalist luxury, all sweeping glass walls, polished marble, and muted tone. It was a space designed for a man who lived his life in absolute, controlled isolation. Tonight, however, it felt entirely wrong. Alina stood in the center of the vast living room, her wet clothes clinging to her skin, shivering despite the climate-controlled air. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the alleyway and the violent rescue was finally ebbing, leaving behind a crushing wave of exhaustion and lingering terror. She wrapped her arms around herself, her eyes daring toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city lights below were beautiful, but they also meant exposure. She could see every shadow, every potential threat. Mummy. Leo's small voice broke through her panic. He was sitting on the massive leather sofa, his legs dangling over the edge. Bernabe, the stray dog, had been thoroughly dried by a team of bewildered maids, and was now curled up on a cashmere throw pillow, snoring. Leo was watching her with those ancient, perceptive hazel eyes. He wasn't crying anymore. He was assessing. I'm okay, Alina lied, forcing a gentle smile as she crossed the room and sat beside him. She pulled him into her lap, burying her face in his damp hair, breathing in the scent of him. He was arm. I'm just tired. Julian emerged from the hallway, having shed his ruined suit jacket. He wore a crisp white dress shirt, the top buttons undone, sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle. He carried a steaming mug of tea and a thick, plush. He moved with a quiet grace that belied his lethal capabilities, setting the mug on the glass coffee table, before draping the blanket over Alina's trembling shoulders. The medical team is on their way to check your neck, Julian said, his voice a low, soothing rumble. And I've had clothes delivered in your size. They should be here shortly. Alina looked up at him, the sheer magnitude of his hitting her like a physical blow. She had spent 3 years looking over her shoulder, flinching at every raised voice, calculating every move to avoid Marquis' wrath. She had forgotten what it felt like to be protected, to be read for. She whispered, her voice thick with unshed tars, you don't even know us. You could have been killed tonight. Julian didn't answer immediately. He knelt on the floor in front of the sofa, bringing himself to Elena's eye level. His eyes weren't, stripping away her defenses. I know exactly who you are, Alina. And I know what it costs to survive in a world that wants to chew you up and spit you out. He reached out, arm hand gently covering hers where it rested on Leo's back. Your son walked into my lobby in the pouring rain and asked for my help. He didn't ask for money. He asked for a fighter. I simply answered the call. Before Alina could process the profound intimacy of his words, the heavy oak door of the penthouse clicked open. Julian's head of security, a grizzled veteran named Vance, stepped in, his expression grim. He held a sleek tablet. Boss, Vance said, his voice tight. We have a problem. The men we left at the brownstone. They woke up, they're talking. But that's not the issue. Julian's demeanor instantly shifted. The gentle protector vanished, replaced by the ruthless CEO. His eyes went cold, his jaw tightening. Talk. They weren't working for the Morettis. Vance continued, glancing nervously at Alina and Leo. At least, not direct. They were hired through a shell company. A company registered to a law firm in the city. Elena's blood ran cold. She knew that law firm. Which one? She demanded, her voice suddenly steady, the matriarchal instinct overriding her FAR. Vance and Associates, Vance replied. Your late husband's former partners. Specifically Marcus Vance. The name hung in the air like poison. Mark's older brother. The man who had always looked at Alina with thinly veiled contempt. The man who had conveniently stepped in to manage the company after her husband's accident. Elena felt a cold fury ignite in her chest, burning away the last remnants of her victimhood. They hadn't just tried to kill her, they had used her own family to do it. They had used her son as bait. He's trying to force the transfer of the company, Elena said, her analytical mind snapping into place. She had spent years playing the grieving, helpless, letting Arrakis and MRK dictate her every move. She had hidden the real ledger. The proof of her husband's murder and the company's true assets. Because she was terrified, but she wasn't terrified anymore. She stood up, the blanket slipping from her shoulders. She walked over to the floor, to ceiling window, looking out at the glittering city. Her reflection in the glass showed a woman transformed. Her posture was straight, her chin raised. The timid socialite was dead. He thinks I'm broken, Elena said, her voice ringing with a newfound, steel-spined authority. She turned to face Julian and Vance. He thinks because I'm a woman, because I'm a mother, that I'll just roll over and sign the papers to keep Leo safe. He thinks I'm weak. She walked back to the sofa, and picked up the mug of tea Julian had brought her. She took a sip, the dubby earth spreading through her chest. She looked at Julian, her hazel eyes blazing with a fierce, unyielding light. Elena read, the words a solemn vow. I am done hiding, I am done playing the victim. If Marcus Vance wants a guar for Vance Logistics, I will give him one. And I will burn his empire to the ground. Julian watched her, a slow, dangerous smile curving his lips. The woman he had pulled from the alley was gone. In her place stood a queen, ready to reclaim her throne. He stood up, stepping into her space, his presence a solid, unwavering wall of support. You won't have to do it alone, Julian murmured, his voice a dark thrilling promise. You have my resources, my legal team, and my protection. Marcus Vance made a fatal error tonight. Elena looked up at him. feeling the electric connection between them. A partnership forged in fire and sealed in blood. She reached out, her small hand resting against his chest, feeling the steady, powerful beat of his heart beside her. Leo patted Julian's leg, his small face serious and resolute. What was his error? Elena asked, her voice a velvet threat. Julian's eyes darkened with lethal intent. He forgot that you have a son who thinks like a grandmaster. And he forgot that you now have me. Elena Schmeier, brilliant expression that held no trace of her past weakness. The storm outside was raging, but inside the penthouse, the true storm was just beginning. And this? She was the one holding the lightning. The Sterling Tower's executive board room was a cathedral of cold, corporate power. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the city, but the atmosphere inside was suffocating. Elena sat at the head of the mahogany table, her posture impeccable, her emerald silk blouse a stark contrast to the sea of charcoal suits surrounding her. Leo sat in a custom-made booster seat, his small legs dangling, a coloring book and crayons spread before him. To the untrained eye, he was merely a child being watched by a sitter. To Elena, he was her most lethal strategic asset. Across the table sat Marcus Vance, his face a mask of practiced, paternalistic concern. He was flanked by two senior partners from his law firm, men who had spent decades looking down on Elena as the grieving, incompetent widow. Marcus began, his voice dripping with condescending sympathy. I understand the incident last night was traumatic, but we must be realistic. Vance Logistics is hemorrhaging money. The Moretti situation has spooked our investors. For the sake of the company, and for Leo's future, it's time to accept the acquisition offer. It's generous, it's safe. Elena didn't blink. She watched him with the detached, analytical gaze of a predator assessing prey. She could feel the old, familiar tremor of fear in her hands. The ghost of the woman who would have signed anything to make the pain stop. She crushed it. She placed her hands flat on the table, her nails painted a sharp blood red. Elena repeated, the word tasting like ash. You mean the offer that values the company at 40% of its actual worth? The offer that conveniently erases the debt you've been secretly accumulating under your shell companies. Marcus's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. I don't know what you're implying, Elena. My legal team has been transparent. Leo piped up, his voice clear and bright, cutting through the heavy silence. He didn't look up from his coloring book. He was meticulously filling in the outline of a lion. That's a funny word, Uncle Marcus. Transparency means you can see through something. But your Cayman accounts are very opaque, like a brick wall. The two senior partners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Marcus's face flushed a mottled pink. Leo, this is adult business. You should be coloring quietly. Leo finally looked up, his hazel eyes, so identical to Elena's, locked onto Marcus with an unnerving, ancient intelligence. I am coloring quietly, but mommy told me that when adults lie, it's important to have the facts. So I printed out the offshore transaction logs from your personal server. The password was your mother's birthday. It was very easy. He reached into his small backpack and slid a single, crisp sheet of paper across the polished mahogany. It wasn't the full ledger. It was a single page, a surgical strike. It detailed a $2.3 million transfer from a Vance Logistics subsidiary to a personal account in the Cayman Islands, dated the day after Elena's husband had died. The silence in the boardroom was absolute. The air conditioning hummed, a deafening roar in the void. Elena picked up the paper, her expression unreadable. She held it up, letting the light from the windows illuminate the damning figures. You see, Marcus, she said, her voice a velvet blade. You made a mistake. You thought I was a grieving widow. You thought I was a helpless mother. You thought I was weak. She stood up, the chair scraping softly against the floor. She walked around the table, her heels clicking a steady, rhythmic beat. She stopped directly behind Marcus, leaning down so her lips were close to his ear. But I am not weak, she whispered, her voice a lethal purr. I am a mother, and I am a Vance. And you have just handed me the weapon I needed to destroy you. Marcus's breath hitched. He tried to stand, but Elena's hand landed on his shoulder, her grip surprisingly strong. Sit. The word, a quiet order that brooked no argument. He sank back into his chair, his face pale, his eyes wide with dawning horror. Elena straightened up, turning to face the room. She looked at the two senior partners. Gentlemen, she said, her voice ringing with absolute authority. You have a choice. You can continue to support a man who has been embezzling from this company and orchestrating the murder of its founder, or you can support the rightful CEO, who has the evidence to put him in prison for the rest of his life. The decision is yours. But know this, I will not forget who stood by my side. and I will not forget who stood against me. The two men exchanged a panicked glance. Then, in unison, they stood up. Vance, the older Pufa, his voice trembling, we were unaware of these transactions. We will, of course, support your leadership. Marcus looked up at her. His eyes filled with a mixture of rage and terror. You can't do this, Elena. You're a child. You're a woman. You don't know how to run a company. It was a cold, brilliant smile that held no woo-woo, only the absolute certainty of victory. I don't need to know how to run a company, Arcus, she said. I have a son who does. And I have a PA Rotner who will burn your world to the ground, if you so much as look at us wrong. As if on cue the Boyard room doors opened. Julian Sterling stepped in. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing a simple black turtleneck and trousers, his presence a DX silent storm. He didn't look at Marcus. He didn't look at the PA Artners. His eyes were fixed solely on Elena and Leo. He walked to the table, his gaze sweeping over the room, a silent declaration of ownership. He stopped beside Elena, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back, a gesture of support that was both intimate and terrifyingly possessive. Is everything resolved? Julian asked, his voice a low rumble that vibrated through the room. Elena leaned into his touch, feeling the solid, unyielding strength of him. She looked at Mar, her eyes flashing with a fierce, triumphant light. Yes, she said, everything is resolved. Julian nodded. He looked down at Leo, who was now holding up his finished coloring page. It was a lion, but not just any lion. It was a lion with a crown, standing over a defeated, shadowy figure. Leo, Julian said, his voice softening in a way that made the two PA Artners flinch. You protected your mother. Leo, his small face radiant with pride. Mommy protected herself, Uncle Julian. I just gave her the map. Elena looked down at her son, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it was almost painful. She had spent her life believing she needed to be saved. She had believed her strength lay in her ability to endure, to suffer in silence, but looking at Leo, at Julian, she realized the truth. Her strength had always been there. It had just been waiting for the right moment to be unleashed. She turned back to Marcus, her expression a broadening. You have 1 hour to vacate this building, she said, her voice a final, irrevocable decree. Your access codes are revoked, your accounts are frozen, and if you so much as attempt to contact Leo or me again, I will ensure that the evidence I have is not just given to the police, but to every major news outlet in the city. Do you understand? Marcus read at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He looked at Julian, at the two partners, at the small boy who had outmaneuvered him with a coloring book and a single sheet of paper. He saw the absolute, unbreakable wall of their unity. He saw his own defeat, total and humiliating. He slumped in his chair, the fight draining out of him. He nodded, a jerky, broken motion. Elena turned her back on him, dismissing him as if he were nothing more than a speck of dust. She took Julian's hand, her fingers intertwining with his. She picked up Leo, cradling him against her hip. Let's go home, she said, her voice a quiet promise. We'll have a company to rebuild. As they walked out of the Boerard room, leaving Marcus Vance in the ruins of his own greed, Elena felt a profound sense of peace. The storm had passed, the Duar was won. But as she stepped into the elevator, catching her reflection in the polished steel doors, she saw something new in her eyes. Not just victory, not just relief, she saw a queen, and she knew, with absolute certainty, that her reign had only just begun. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the city washed clean and gleaming under the golden hour sun. The penthouse of the Sterling Tower, once a monument to cold isolated power, was now bathed in a dew-warm amber glow. The floor-to-ceiling windows no longer felt like a barrier against the world, but a frame for the vibrant, living city below. Elena stood in the center of the living room, a glass of champagne resting lightly in her hand. She wore a simple, elegant silk dress, her hair falling in soft waves around her shoulders. Blood-red nails that had gripped the mahogany Board room table were now painted a soft, fluorescent white. The woman who had stood in the rain, shivering and terrified, was a ghost. The queen who had reclaimed her throne was entirely, unapologetically, across the room. Julian sat in a plush armchair, a book resting forgotten on his lap. He wasn't reading, he was watching her. His dark eyes held a depth of emotion that would have terrified his business rivals. But it was the safest place in the world. He had been her shield, her sword, and her anchor. But he had never tried to be her savior. He had simply given her the strength to save herself. Mummy, Leo's small voice broke the comfortable silence. He was sitting on the rug, surrounded by a sprawling, intricate cityscape he had built from architectural blocks. Now plump, clean, and wearing a custom cashmere collar, was asleep at his feet. Leo looked up, his hazel eyes bright with a mixture of pride and curiosity. Re the bad men gone forever, he asked, his analytical mind still processing the aftermath of the Beau Rodrum coup. Elena set her glass down and walked over to him. Kneeling on the rug, she pulled him into her lap, breathing in the familiar, comforting scent of him. Yes, my brave boy, she whispered, pressing a kiss to his forehead. They're gone. And they can never, ever hurt us again. Leo nodded, satisfied. He picked up a small, silver block, holding it up to the light. I built a fortress, he said, his tone matter of fact, with high walls, and a moat so no one can get in. Elena smiled, a genuine, radiant expression that reached her eyes. That's a very smart fortress, Leo. Julian stood up and crossed the room, his movements silent and graceful. He knelt beside them, his presence a wooey arm, solid weight against Elena's side. He reached out, his large hand gently covering Leo's small one where it held the silver block. It's a perfect fortress, Julian murmured, his voice a low, soothing rumble. But you know what makes it truly impenetrable? Leo looked at him, his brow furrowing in thought. The family inside it, Julian replied, his gaze shifting from the boy to Elena. The love in his eyes was a tangible force, a quiet, unyielding. As long as we stand together, no wall can be breached. Elena felt a lump form in her throat. She leaned her head against Julian's shoulder, the soft, steady beat of his heart a comforting rhythm against her cheek. She thought back to the rain-slicked alleyway, to the cold brick wall she had pressed herself against, to the desperate, terrifying promise she had whispered to a shivering stray. I won't let them take you, I promise. She had kept that promise, but in the keeping of it, she had discovered a strength she never knew she possessed. She had found a partner who matched her fire, a son who was her greatest ally, and a home that was built not on wealth or status, but on an unbreakable, fiercely protective love. Leo looked down at the silver block in his hand, then up at his mother and the man who had become his father in every way that mattered. He placed the block carefully on top of his block city, completing the structure. It's strong, Leo. His voice filled with the absolute certainty of a child who knows he is safe. Elena looked at the completed fortress, then at the two men who were her entire world. The storm was over, the Duer was won, the future was theirs to build. Yes, it is, Elena whispered, her voice thick with a profound, one piece. She reached out, her hand covering Julian's and Leo's where they rested on the rug. It's unbreakable. Outside, the city lights began to twinkle against the twilight sky, a million points of light in a vast, beautiful world. But inside the penthouse, the only light that mattered was the one they had forged together in the darkness. And it would never, ever go out.